Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, welcome back, John Hagan. He's an ophthalmologist, and today's Kevin MD article is From Marathons to Moderation, Rethinking Endurance Exercise. John, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here.
So John's been on in the past. Go to kevinmd.com/podcast to hear his story and his prior episode. But today, let's jump right into your most recent article, From Marathons to Moderation, Rethinking Endurance Exercise. For those who didn't get a chance to read this article, what's it about?
I have been a marathoner since 1969, and I have exercised since childhood. And I have had a lifelong commitment to good health. And I've never voluntarily done anything that I thought was unhealthy. So no smoking, no drinking, good diet. And about 90, it's hard to believe that I was young once. I'm closer to 81 than I am to 80. But in the early 50s, which was my early childhood, exercise was bad. And I might add parenthetically at this point, if you follow the science, eventually you're going to go over the cliff unless you have an open mind. So I have lived through exercise is bad, exercise is good. A lot of exercise is even better, to the point where exercise hurts your heart. And same way when I was young, smoking was okay, made you look cool, and coffee was bad, give you a heart attack. And so we have to have an open mind to how things change. So in 1969, I was a senior medical student at Loyola University in Chicago, and Ken Cooper came out with his book, Aerobics. And I was just blown away by that. And I decided that the way I would keep my heart and my arteries healthy was by running. And again, to look backwards, in the 50s, heart disease was attributed to working too hard. When I was young, there was episodic deaths in males in their 40s from myocardial disease. I mean, I can remember two classmates in high school that their dad just dropped dead. And it was ascribed to working too hard. And, he's working too hard, it caused a heart attack. People have a heart attack, they send them to bed. Ladies have a baby, send them to bed. Rest was the thing. And the idea that exercise might be good for you and that not exercising bad for you was a totally new paradigm. So many of us physicians are overachievers, and my motto has always been too much is not enough. Mm-hmm. So I started marathoning running and continued that for a long, long time through my internship, my residency, my time in the Air Force, and then in 1975 when I came to Kansas City to practice ophthalmology. And I was a first-year subscriber to Runner's World. I belonged to an organization called the American Medical Joggers Association. And the grand poobah of the American Medical Joggers Association was Tom Bassler. He was a pathologist. And the Bassler hypothesis was that anyone that could run a marathon, it would prevent ever having a myocardial infarct or coronary artery disease. And I believe that. So I ran and ran and ran and ran. And as a physician, I thought I need to have some scientific background for this. So the movement from exercise is bad to exercise is good, there's three individuals that really have contributed the most. One was Jeremiah Morris, and he's a Scottish physiologist. Mm-hmm. And he did a brilliant study from about 48 to 52 in which he studied London bus drivers. And these are two-story conveyances. And they have a driver who sits in the whole shift and drives. And then they have a conductor that's constantly moving, never sits down, and is climbing up to the second floor. And he followed these individuals to see if there was a difference in their cardiovascular health. And by far, the group that was healthiest were the ones that moved the most. Mm-hmm. And then Jeremiah Stamler, who was a cardiologist, actually was in Chicago the same time that I was at Loyola. He looked at the same data, conducted his own data, and he was the individual that came up with risk factors. And one of the risk factors was lack of exercise. So we got a 180-degree turn. And then there was my personal muse, and that was Ken Cooper. And I read his book, and to Dr. Cooper's credit, he never recommended hyperexercise. He recommended moderation.
Mm-hmm.
But again, with my too much is not enough, I took off. So over the next 20, 25 years, I ran about 30 half marathons, 4 marathons, a dozen or more short triathlons, 2 half Ironman triathlons, just the whole deal. And at this point, I was pretty smug. I thought, my gosh, I've built a heart that's just invincible. I'm going to live to be 100, and I'm not going to die of cardiovascular disease. And when I was in my early 60s, I was taking a shower and I noticed my pulse was doing something crazy. I've never done this before. So I checked my pulse and it was irregular. And although I'm an ophthalmologist, I remember enough from medical school saying, oh my God, I'm in atrial fibrillation. So I went to the hospital and the cardiology group there confirmed the diagnosis. They did a complete cardiovascular workup. And I had what at that time was called lone atrial fibrillation, which is AFib in the lack of coronary artery disease. They basically did not tell me to modify my exercise, but I started reading on my own. And again, I've had a Runner's World subscription since about 1967. And there started to be deaths and heart disease among marathoners. Jim Fixx wrote a book which was widely read, and he died while running. Alberto Salazar, who was an internationally famous long-distance runner, had a cardiac arrest while running and was reportedly clinically dead for 14 minutes. And a number of people developed coronary artery disease and needed bypasses. And one of the things they were espousing in terms of technology, and this was not in the medical journals, this was in Runner's World, was a coronary artery calcium score done by CT. So I asked my cardiologist at that time about that test, and they said, no, we don't need it. It won't show us anything we don't know. It's an expensive test. There's radiation. Just, essentially forget about it. And I'm a pretty compliant person. So I did, but I was pretty uncomfortable. And then something very fortuitous happened. That was my insurance changed. I had to get a new cardiologist.
Sure.
So I looked around, and an internationally known preventive cardiologist here in Kansas City is James O'Keefe. And he is widely published, widely known. And fortunately, I could get on his schedule. So I went in and I told him my tale of woe about atrial fibrillation and so forth. And then I asked him about getting the coronary artery calcium score. And he said, that's a great idea. I was going to recommend it myself. So if there's ever any test that I thought I was going to ace, it was that one. So I had the test. I went home. They told me they'd have the results in a few days. And about 2 hours after I had the test done, Dr. O'Keefe's office called me and said, can you have your wife drive you to the office immediately? Probably most of you know, but a coronary artery calcium score is 0. And if it's less than 100, you can probably live with that. Mine was 1,606.
Wow.
And yeah, that's kind of over the top. And the calcium is a surrogate for atherosclerosis, so plaque burden, essentially. So this indicated right off coronary artery disease. So then I had an even more extensive workup, and that also was normal. My lipids were good. Nevertheless, they put me on statins. And one of the things that I've done for the last 23 years is I'm the editor of Missouri Medicine Medical Journal. And about the time this was all going on, we got an article from Dr. Schwartz in Minneapolis, belongs to a cardiology group there. And they had looked at a large number of senior runners and compared them with non-runners with similar cardiovascular risk factors. and identified that the running group, like myself, had elevated coronary artery calcium scores.
Mm.
So with the idea that how could I spend all this time running and have an artery that's full of stone, I consulted with Dr. O'Keefe. He said, yeah, that's the way things are going. And so just prior to the Boston Marathon in 2014, Missouri Medicine published a full set of articles outlining the research that showed this increased coronary artery. And the running world went wild. I mean, I didn't get death threats, but they told me, what is it with you? What is it with your medical journal? Is medical journal in flyover country? How could you possibly do this? I was called by a cardiologist from Harvard. I won't say his name,
Mm-hmm.
but he essentially read me the riot act also. So what has happened since then is that the subsequent literature done all over the world has validated this, and also validated that hyperexercisers, and I'm talking about people who go out and pedal to the metal for over an hour, especially those over 40, have an increased incidence of atrial fibrillation and coronary artery calcium score. Now, the question at that time was, if I, who basically try and take care of myself, have a coronary artery score of 1606, and you compare it to the typical cardiovascular patient, hypertensive, smoking, overweight, bad diet, is the risk factor the same? And the answer is no. The runners, the hyperexercise, the people that lead good diets and good lifestyle, the risk is much, much lower. And the question came, why is that? And what has been found is that the plaque in runners like myself, they have a high calcium density, they're fibrotic, they're low-lying, the endothelium is fairly rigorous, and they do not appear to be very prone to causing thrombosis in coronary arteries.
Okay.
The typical patient that most of your viewers know with multiple risk factors, of course, their atheroma are high-lying, fat, and easily thrombotic.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives me some peace of mind, but if I could go back and know what we knew now about exercise, hyperexercise, I would be a 10K runner. And as preparation for this, I've been doing literature search, and there's lots and lots of literature that has substantiated what I've just reviewed. However, there are cardiologists and some studies that make the point that hyperexercisers live longer than the average bear.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is not a good study. A better study would be, do hyperexercisers live longer and better than mild exercisers, like someone that runs a 10K or a 6 mile? And I could not find that study.
Sure.
I don't think it's been done. So my advice to anyone that's interested is live a healthy lifestyle. Exercise is one of the most important things to keep yourself healthy, but do it in moderation. If you have to do a marathon, build up to it, do the marathon, take that off your bucket list, and then drop back to an easy 10K or moderate running. I think that's by far the healthiest thing to do.
Sure. So when you say hyper exercise, what is the definition for that? What category of exercisers does this affect, this elevated coronary calcium score?
Well, there's no hard and fast definition, but basically what we're talking about is all out exercise for an hour or more. Now, when you run a marathon, you're out there 4 to 5 hours. And, I've done a half triathlon, half Ironman, and I was out there for like 9 hours, 8 hours. So you can get all the benefits of exercise by exercising moderately for 30 to 45 minutes, and you'll have a lot more time for your practice or your family or your kids or, whatever you want to do. I think it's a smart thing to do.
So, for those who quote unquote hyper exercise, should they be worried about their coronary artery calcium score? Should they be getting these scans to see what that number is?
Well, obviously Jimmy Fix would, obviously Alberto Salazar would. So being an elite athlete doesn't doesn't shield you from coronary artery disease or sudden cardiac death. So I would say yes. I would say first of all, the smart thing is just don't do it. Do your long distance and then drop back. But if you've been a hyper exerciser and you plan on doing it, I would certainly recommend that you have a coronary artery calcium score and of course check all your other cardiac parameters, stress tests and so forth.
So, in terms of the current thinking among the marathon community, is this, as far as you can tell, a concern for them? Are there guidelines perhaps looking for elevated coronary artery calcium score in this subgroup, or is this something that is not quite in the mainstream yet?
No, it's definitely in the mainstream. And one other thing I forgot to mention, I just like introduce paresthetically, and I've spoken to Dr. Cooper about this. One of the concerns of people that look into this is running your immune system down. And there have been some very, very, very prominent world-class athletes, marathon runners like Greta Vates, that have died of cancer, as well as Fred Lebo, who was head of the New York Marathon. And here in Kansas City, our prime female marathoner also died of cancer. So that's another reason. But to get back to your question, yes, the marathon community is very aware of this, and most of them have come over. Now, you have to realize that there's a whole industry out there of sports apparel, shoes, and so forth like that. This threatens their livelihood. So you're not going to find Nike or some of these other ones proposing that. The other thing, I won't mention a name, but for the last 10 years, I have been in contact by email with a several-time winner of the Boston Marathon. I mean, just a legend. And he also has a elevated coronary artery score, not quite as high as mine, it's like 900, something like that. And he has chosen to continue to run and marathon distances. He runs in Boston every year. And he's done okay so far. But there are runners that haven't done so well.
We're talking to John Hagan. He's an ophthalmologist. Today's KevinMD article is From Marathons to Moderation, Rethinking Endurance Exercise. John, as always, we'll end with some of your take-home messages that you like to leave with the KevinMD audience.
Well, have an open mind, and this applies to everything in medicine, and realize that exercise done properly in moderation is one of the most important keystones of remaining healthy. But you can do too much. Just to get back to marathons for a moment, one of the big risk factors initially was getting dehydrated. So people were told to drink as much water as much as possible while they ran marathons. Well, then people started dying of water intoxication, dilutional hypernatremia. So everything in moderation, exercise, if you're going to run, keep it easy. If you have to do a marathon, do it, get it off the list, and then drop back.
John, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Kevin. I enjoyed being here. Thank you so much.